revolutionaries, we operate in conditions which are not of our choosing. And there are times when it is not possible for us to have a material effect on reality. When we are reduced to politically analysing the situation, building by ones and twos if we can, and preparing for future developments. But I think it is already clear, even before we begin this discussion on British perspectives, that the time we are going into will not be one of those times. And I don't want to intrude onto the next discussion on party building, but I do just want to begin by saying that we have to go from this Congress with a real renewed urgency to drive to 2,500 members as quickly as we can, and then to 3,000 and beyond. Because if we are strong enough, then we will be able to have a decisive effect on the class struggles that will take place in Britain in the coming periods. As Peter said this morning, we are not yet a decisive factor in the way that we were able to be in the poll tax struggle or the struggle of Liverpool City Council. But already, we and our international are able to have an impact on events. We've seen the fantastic water charges struggle that we've just heard about. Clearly, our Irish section is having an effect on events. The revolutionary left defeating the first defeat on the PP government with the magnificent school student strike, the work of our US comrades. But also here in Britain, particularly at local level, we do have a qualitative effect in different struggles. Look at the Butterfields housing victory that has taken place since the last Congress, or the role of our members in the leadership of the RMT on the London Underground, where the RMT has been able to inflict real blows against management in the course of its recent struggles. And of course as well, in many areas, in Huddersfield and Leicester in particular, where we've been able to lead mass movements on the question of the NHS. And we are also beginning to play a role on a national level. We all saw it last Saturday. I think it's been mentioned in every single lead-off so far, the role that we played on the NHS demonstration that took place last weekend. We understood that the anger that exists on the question of the NHS, the solidarity that working class people feel towards it, and the huge cuts coming down the road meant that the kind of big demonstration that took place last Saturday was possible. We won the demonstration being organised, and then in many parts of the country, it was Socialist Party members alongside others that were key to mobilising for that demonstration, because it was a demonstration organised from below. In the end, there were 13 national trade unions, I think, that backed it, with varying degrees of enthusiasm. Particularly in the case of Unison, the biggest public sector union, while different regions backed it, while many Unison members came on it. In reality, the leadership of Unison backed it through gritted teeth, not even been able to prepare to hand over the measly £500 they promised to contribute towards it, and were continuing to sabotage it as far as they could up until the day that it took place. Still, at this stage, the official position of the Unison leadership is that they do not even oppose the STPs that are going to slash, trash and privatise our NHS, but have the idea it should be taken on a case-by-case basis. That will not stand on the basis of the arguments that will be put by Unison members against that position. Because there's no question, the very working class character of that demonstration, it was probably a majority of NHS workers actually, despite the role of many of the union leaders, and the confidence of that demonstration, its size, will have increased the feeling of NHS workers that it's possible to fight back and to stop the STPs being implemented. And we have an important role to play now on building on the success of that demonstration, of fighting for coordinated strike action, as Jackie argued for on the platform last Saturday, on the question of the STPs and the cuts, but also over the issue of pay, of arguing that the TUC should use its power, more than 6 million members, to organise a massive demonstration in defence of the health service, but also by putting flesh on the Health Campaigns Together body, by building local NHS campaigns that affiliate to that body, in order to be able to step up and build the community campaigns, the local demonstrations, which in turn can give confidence to workers to take strike action and even to occupy hospitals against their threatened closure. Obviously, in the health service, the primary issue is the huge cuts coming down the road, the 22 billion that is due to be cut by 2020. But the question of the public sector pay cap is also important. It's been in place for so long. Public sector workers have suffered so much, and the union leaders have failed to take action in general, in many cases for so long, there can be a feeling that it's not possible to fight on the question of the pay cap. But at the same time, the pay squeeze is continuing. I mean, the IFS now are saying that wages will still be at the same level in 2022 as they were in 2007. 15 years of lost earnings. Larry Elliott made the point in The Guardian yesterday that you've got to go back to the Battle of Trafalgar to find the last time that workers' wages were squeezed over such a prolonged period of time. And even quite limited increases in prices and inflation in that circumstance can tip people over the edge into not being able to manage. And so you can see a renewed movement on the question of pay in general and public sector pay as a result of the feeling that we just cannot survive anymore. Now, I'd make another general point. At last year's conference, when we discussed Jeremy Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, one of the arguments we made was that while it is essential, as we have done, to energetically put forward what is necessary to win the battle inside the Labour Party, in the end, it will be the role that we play in the class struggle outside of the Labour Party which will have the more decisive effect on the battles taking place within it. And I think the NHS also makes that clear. Because if you look at the various issues which could lift Corbyn up, which could push him to the left and stop him retreating endlessly in the face of the Blairites, a mass movement in defence of our NHS is very clearly something that is more likely than some other issues to bring that about. This is also an issue on which the Tories could be forced to retreat or even be brought down. The narrative of the capitalist media over recent weeks has been, well, it's Labour that's divided. The Tories are united, they're in a strong position. But it's rubbish. I mean, in the Commons, temporarily, at least before the budget, they managed to keep a veneer of unity over the question of Brexit. But look at the Lords, where the big beasts who were ministers from Tory governments in the 1980s were taking lumps out of each other over the question of Brexit. That's the real division that exists in the Tory party. And we did, in the budget, get a glimpse of how weak the May government is, with a tiny, tiny majority. This national insurance move they made, which of course the policy wonks think is a tremendously good idea, in reality trying to stem the tide against the casualisation of British capitalism as a result of their system, which means that more and more people in every sector of industry are self-employed. But it might be a good idea as far as the policy wonks are concerned. Even George Osborne, of pasty tax fame, apparently for 4 years was told by the Treasury, you should do this on national insurance, and said, don't be stupid. I'm not doing that. That would be political suicide because of the consequences amongst a layer of better off self-employed workers who currently vote for the Tory party. So they're an extremely weak government. And the NHS does have an element of the poll tax. In many areas, it's not yet known what the STPs will mean in terms of which hospitals will shut. That will come out in the course of coming months. But it is already clear that whatever happens, even if we didn't exist, there would be local mass movements against hospital closures, and that they would not just or even mainly affect the major cities, but will affect the rural areas, as was also the case with, the poll tax. But there is the possibility, as there was in the poll tax movement, of us playing a role in leading, in cohering that struggle and turning it from a disparate series of local protests into a cohesive, organised working class movement which potentially could defeat the Tories and even lead to the election of a Corbyn-led Labour government. Of course, it's not the same as the poll tax. There are also many, many differences. It doesn't affect Wales in the terms of the STPs, although they do have NHS cuts. Clearly, the role of NHS workers is central in this struggle that is taking place in the NHS. But another big difference between then and now is that, important as the NHS struggle is, it is only one of a multiplicity of different issues around which we could see struggles developing. Look at what's taking place on schools. Also in the budget, the expansion of free schools, May's vanity project on grammars, at the same time as huge cuts taking place in school funding. A conference reported in The Guardian this morning of the head teachers union didn't allow the cameras in so that they could boo the education minister. This is the head teachers. They're talking about a combination of just refusing to make the cuts, deficit financing, of only opening schools for 4 days a week, and of writing to parents, which many of them are already doing, saying, give us 250 quid or whatever to save our school and allow it to continue to operate a full timetable. This question of the school cuts is a big issue amongst parents, amongst teachers, also amongst school students. We would like to begin to emulate the work of Revolutionary Left. We're not at the same level, but I tell you, there will be the possibility of organising school student strikes around these huge cuts that are going to be taking place in the schools. There is also the universities, the higher education bill, the commercialisation of education, the question of housing, which clearly all the comrades know is a devastating crisis. On the quiet, actually the government have retreated over the last period on a number of aspects of the Housing Act. And, we should be clear, objectively, from the point of view of capitalism, particularly in London and the South East, and the South West as well, actually, social housing would make sense because they need some poor people to do the crap jobs, and nobody can afford to live in London. But while that's true, the short-term profits of capitalism and the fortunes of the Tory party are tied to the huge bubble in house prices which exists, which means that even this Help to Buy policy, which we always knew was really about reinflating the housing bubble, but it's now become absolutely clear it's not being used to help people buy in places that are expensive. It's being used in the areas of the country where house prices are lowest in order to create a housing bubble. That is the means, that is what the Tories are doing with it. And again, this question of the possibility of even a small increase in interest rates. Debts are now back up to the levels of 2008. People are really struggling to pay mortgages. A small interest rate could see evictions taking place from private housing on a scale that didn't take place at the height of the crisis in 2007, 2008. At the same time, rents are continuing to skyrocket, and combined with benefit cuts, it is leading to a huge surge in homelessness. The official figures are that there's been a 16% increase in the number of street homelessness in the last year. I don't believe it. You walk the streets of London late at night or earlier in the morning, there is more than a 16%. I have never seen, not even in the 80s, the scale of street homelessness that exists in London at the moment. And of course, the government's intention to cut housing benefit for 18 to 21-year-olds will only increase that further. So there is the real possibility of the development of a further movement on the issue of housing. And we have to remember, the crime for the housing crisis is not only laying at the government's feet, but also at the feet of Labour councils. As we say in the document, Labour councils currently have sufficient capital reserves with prudential borrowing to build 100,000 council houses in this year alone. And unfortunately, while Jeremy Corbyn has correctly called for a mass council house building programme to be implemented by a Labour government, the desire not to come into conflict with the right of the Labour Party that dominate the councils means there has been no clear call for councils to act and build council housing in the here and now. And of course, that's not only on the narrow question of council housing. The other issue, which can be very important in the next year, is the question of council cuts in general, on which we have been pioneers. For years, we were the only people who said it was possible to set no-cuts budgets. And it seems sometimes like no one else in the trade union or the workers' movement would ever take the idea up. But now, under the pressure from below, the severity of the cuts that are taking place, the trade union movement is being forced to adopt more and more, edging in the direction of a no-cuts position. Even the bastion of the right wing, the Wales TUC, now stand for legal no-cuts budgets. But also Unite. Apparently in the Unite executive last week, and let's remember, our comrade was booed for raising this issue a couple of years ago, but in the Unite executive this week, they agreed that they would employ people to train Scottish Labour councillors to implement legal no-cuts budgets. Now, we'll see what that actually means, but it's an indication of the pressure that they are under, as is North Ayrshire, a Labour council, saying that they're adopting a no-cuts budget. Looking at the detail, it probably isn't a real, fully no-cuts budget, and the essential point for us is they are not using it as a means to prepare for a struggle against the government. It's no good just as a stopgap. But nonetheless, the fact that they are declaring that's what they've done is an indication and a vindication of our stance. For us, it's never about just buying another day for the sake of it. Adopting a no-cuts budget, using borrowing powers and reserves to do it, is in order to choose the best possible ground for a fight with the government and to defeat them on this issue. But our role on the question of council cuts is not only recognised very reluctantly in the trade union and labour movement, it is also recognised by the capitalist class. I don't know how many of you read the report of Theresa May speaking to the Conservative Councillors Conference just a couple of weeks ago, where she talked about how the militant was, in Liverpool was a bogeyman, and we had to make sure that that didn't happen again. That is a repetition of what Osborne talked about back in 2015, where he said Thatcher had no choice but to take control of local government because of the behaviour of militant in Liverpool, but we now have safe pairs of hands who can be relied upon to act responsibly, i.e. Labour councils who are prepared to carry out the cuts. And Theresa May was raising the prospect of Corbynite councillors moving in the direction of Liverpool. Even The Guardian said there don't seem to be many signs of that from Labour councils around the country at the moment. But by the way, while it's true that Labour councils are a bulwark of the right in general within the Labour Party, at the same time, the severity of the cuts, the nightmare of what people are being asked to implement, means at a certain stage you can get some of them saying, no, no more. We're not prepared to do it, and we're going to refuse to carry out the cuts. Now, I think it's clear, it's uncontroversial here, that it's always been our stance that we support any Labour councillor who is prepared to oppose the cuts. And we welcome Jeremy Corbyn using Prime Minister's questions to expose the behind-the-scenes sweetheart deal done by Surrey Tory Council. But of course, we have to use that, as we have done, to say, why is no Labour Council doing anything to oppose the cuts? A comrade sent me yesterday a survey done by Liverpool Labour Council, which was published in the Liverpool Echo, and it was on the horror of austerity. And it's heartbreaking. And it's got about how 55,000 people are worse off as a result of Tory cuts. And it interviews people who've been evicted because of the bedroom tax and so on and so forth. And it's criminal, because every single thing they describe, the bedroom tax evictions, the council tax hikes, the cuts to benefit that have led to people being evicted from private property, every single one of them was implemented by the Labour Council. That's what they're reduced to, crying about policies that they have implemented. And of course, at the same time, at this stage, generally, there is no attempt by the Labour left to fight for anti-cuts councillors to be selected. And therefore, I think there will be complete agreement here that it is right that in this May's elections, TUSC goes ahead and stands, not across the board, but stands against the most right-wing, for example, some of the Owen Smith backing Labour candidates that are standing in this May's elections. Because if we were to fail to do that, particularly given our long record on this issue, at a time when we are beginning to see more determined struggles against cuts at local level, seeing the Durham and the Derby teaching assistants fighting back and so on, then we would be vacating the scene at exactly the wrong moment. We have to be prepared to give the movement against cuts at local level an electoral voice. If we weren't to do that, it would not be understood by the best activists, not least by the best activists in the RMT, who have successfully fought to defend the RMT support from TUSC against serious attempts by the right wing to break that link between TUSC and the RMT. And we think it's clear that if we don't stand, we leave the field open to other protest candidates, for the Greens to pick up, even for the Lib Dems, outrageously, to pick up, UKIP, in some cases, to pick up. Of course, we're not big enough to stop that completely, but we have to attempt to offer a real alternative. Because we saw in last year's elections, we expected ourselves, maybe the Greens, to be squeezed in the elections, as people thought, no, we're going to vote Labour because Jeremy Corbyn, he's against austerity. But actually, that wasn't the process that took place. There was a whole layer of people, our vote went up a bit, who voted for TUSC, who voted for the Greens, who voted for Plaid in Wales, and said, yes, we support Jeremy Corbyn, but our local Labour council's got nothing to do with Jeremy Corbyn, and therefore we support you standing against him. Of course, not everybody will understand. Some good people around Jeremy Corbyn will think we shouldn't stand at this point in time. They will learn later on the basis of experience. Now, we found throughout the Corbyn era that our welcoming Corbyn's victory, but our preparedness to fight objectively for what is objectively needed for a mass workers' party with a socialist programme, and to use the opportunity created by Corbyn's election to push in that direction, is understood and welcomed by the best elements who've been enthused by Corbynism, including the question of standing in elections. And that is because we've got to remember those people did not sign up to the Labour Party in the main because they were loyal to Labour. Even the ones who were previous Labour Party members had left in disgust, in reality, over Blair, over the Iraq War, or whatever. They signed up because they saw the chance to get an anti-austerity party. So if you look at the figures, these are in the documents, of the Ashcroft polling that was done during the leadership election last summer, 54% of Corbyn supporters and 49% of all union voters in that election said that if Corbyn had lost it and he had split away and set up a new party, they would have gone with him. It wasn't about Labour, it was about a party that was genuinely anti-austerity. And that layer, at this stage, in the main, are not active in the Labour Party. They may have gone to some meetings, but their experience of them means many of them have turned away, and we are more likely to meet them on NHS demos, on picket lines, canvassing in the local elections, than we are to meet them in the Labour Party at this point in time. So we can say there are many different issues around which struggles can take place and in which we can meet this politicised layer. There are also the question of social movements. The huge demonstrations we've seen against Trump taking place in the immediate aftermath of his elections, a growing mood against racism. It's very good for us that Trump is talking about coming to Britain in October, because it's during term time and there is the real possibility that we could lead mass walkouts that could spread beyond the schools, the colleges and the universities, even into the workplaces perhaps in some areas, around the question of the day that Trump comes to Britain. So there are many different issues around which we will see struggle. What are the central features that we need to get across to comrades when they report back from this Congress to the branches, when you report back? We would say the possibility of explosive struggles on all kinds of different issues, and more generally, uncertainty. Because it's not easy to see. We have to be prepared for rapid changes in the situation, developing really day by day. Think what's taken place since the last Congress, to give you some idea. It's a general truth. In a period where capitalism is in crisis, then you see splits within the capitalist class, and we can all see those globally taking place at the moment, growing divisions and battles between the different wings of the capitalist class, but also growing class battles. And we can outline how that will develop, but you can't always predict the outcome of a battle before it's engaged. So we have to be prepared for different possibilities. That was shown with the Brexit referendum. At our Congress last year, we said that workers could pick up the Brexit referendum and use it as a stick with which they could beat the Tory government. We've been proved absolutely right on that, of course, obviously to everybody, but it doesn't mean that we could say that definitely exit was going to win rather than remain. We're not crystal ball gazers. We can't work out exactly what the outcome will be, but of course, the difference between Brexit winning and Remain winning are quite significant in terms of the crisis it has meant for the capitalist class, for the Tory party, and so on. And there are many issues in 2017 as well on which we cannot give certain predictions. A new stage of the economic crisis is on the agenda globally, as we've already discussed. It is also on the agenda here in Britain. We can say, given the weakness of British capitalism, Jared spoke about capitalism's low productivity growth globally this morning, Britain is the bottom of all of the economically advanced capitalist countries alongside Italy. It has absolutely puny, virtually non-existent productivity growth. So we can say when there is a crisis, Britain is not going to fare particularly well. But that doesn't mean we can work out the timing. We can say with certainty that the Tory party faced the biggest crisis since their split over the Corn Laws in 1846. But that doesn't mean we can predict exactly when that split will come to the surface or how it will develop. Nor, in my personal view, can we be certain on the question of a general election. Will May call a snap general election? We put in the perspectives documents all the reasons that the capitalist class wouldn't want her to go for a snap general election. And the difficulties for the Tory party. Can they really maintain their veneer of unity on Brexit through a general election campaign? I'd have to add, that budget did not look like a pre-election budget to anybody. So they've got big reasons to avoid a general election, but still, such is the trap that May is caught in, you cannot rule out her being forced to go in that direction simply to try and get a bigger parliamentary majority. Nor can we say with certainty whether Brexit will actually take place or in what form. It's clear that, first of all, the EU may not exist in its current form, given the crisis in other countries in Europe by the time the negotiations are over. But it's clear that the majority of the capitalist class are desperate to step back and, if possible, to reverse Brexit. But only those who are no longer in the front line of politics can say so openly. Blair can say so, Heseltine can say so. You're in government. You can't say that. Clearly, at this point in time, because of the political consequences of doing so. Because at the moment, despite all of their attempts to explain economic Armageddon facing, the reasons not to go for Brexit, the opinion polls are not moving. That could change in the future. You could have an equivalent of Ireland, where they repeated the Lisbon Treaty vote and got a different result. But that wasn't after 8 years of austerity. It will not necessarily be the case that they can get away with that this time round. So we are not, and we cannot be, kind of professional horoscope readers or crystal ball gazers, but we do have to sketch out the main trends that are likely to develop, and now even more than when we said it in last year's perspectives document, take Trotsky's phrase that our job is not idle speculation, but a strategy for action. We say in the document that there's no period of history exactly comparable to the times that we are living through now. And that relates to the points that were touched on in the last discussion about the question of consciousness and what we've described over a long period of time since the start of the economic crisis about the scissors, the gap between objective reality, the crisis of capitalism, and the understanding of the working class about the possibility of changing society. And as we said, the working class went into the economic crisis unprepared for what was coming, without a mass party, with a lower level of trade union organisation, and without a mass socialist consciousness. And so we didn't see the rapid developments in consciousness that perhaps we would have hoped for at the time the crisis began. But nonetheless, consciousness today is not where it was in 2007, 2008. Workers have shown an enormous capacity to struggle again and again, which I don't need to describe here. And even the development of Corbynism. What was it at bottom? It was a section of the radicalised middle class and the working class deciding they could have a chance to get their own party that was clearly anti-austerity. What is that, if not a development of consciousness from where we were in 2007, 2008? And we have also seen, industrially, in the workplaces, a development of consciousness. Strikes are still, by historical standards, at a low level. So up until October of last year, there were 281,000 strike days lost, and that is an increase from the previous year, but it's still barely 1% of the figure for 1979, for example. So it's still, by historical standards, at a low level. But at the same time, we are seeing the beginnings of a 21st century version of new unionism, of the unorganised, getting organised and taking action. We are also seeing previously middle-class sections of society, the junior doctors above all, adopting the methods of the working class. And we're seeing the battle between capital and labour becoming much sharper on both sides. So the bosses are going to break unions in some strikes. But on the other side, what existed 10 years ago, where in general strikes were for a day, and they were protests really, rather than an attempt to win, that is gone for important sections of workers. You are seeing more strikes which are a strike to the finish. And of course we've seen, above all, the attempt to break the RMT, the despicable role of the TUC in facilitating that, but how that has been pushed back by the determination of the RMT members, but also the magnificent role played by ASLEF drivers in rejecting the deal on Southern Rail. So there's an increased bitterness and determination to fight amongst sections of workers. Now, the introduction of the new anti-trade union laws will mark a change in that situation, which we have to discuss. They've just come into existence. And it's clear they're an obstacle for any legal strike action. I don't mean we can't have legal strike action. I mean they're an extra obstacle that has to be overcome. And while in general, even in the short term, there will be sectional and local strikes that go ahead legally under the anti-trade union laws, in the short term, it will make national and particularly general coordinated strike action more difficult. Now, we have to be clear here, by the way. a union defies the law or not has always been a tactical question. You have to weigh up the balance of forces at a particular stage. But there will be incidences, possibly in the quite near future, where workers will have to do what the POA regularly do and defy the law in order to take strike action. And we can be in the situation of having to lead those strikes which are either directly in defiance of the law or using innovative methods such as duvet days and so on in order to take strike action. We know that the right-wing trade union leaders and even a layer of left national leaders will be thinking, national action's off the agenda now, don't have to worry about that. But we cannot give in to that idea. We have to continue to argue for coordinated strike action, for a 24-hour general strike where it's appropriate, and for national action in different disputes. And we have to be aware that while this is a real complication, it can develop potentially more quickly than we think. To give two examples, the NHS, a mass movement in the communities on the health service could give workers the confidence to strike against the STPs in the NHS. And to give another, so far the government have held back from attempts to use the anti-trade union laws to go for sequestration and action, for example, against the POA or other unions in a big way. But if they were to do that at a certain stage, and if the laws are being ignored, they'll be under huge pressure to move in that direction, then we would have to call for a 24-hour general strike in support of the union threatened with sequestration. And by the way, even if it was a relatively small number of workers who came out, but it was some of the most militant workers who, in the case of the transport unions, for example, have big industrial power, it could be possible to give the government a bloody nose over that issue. So we are seeing already the development of consciousness industrially, and we can see it on the basis of events developing much more quickly. At this stage, it still wouldn't be true to say that there is a mass socialist consciousness, in the sense of broad layers of the working class understanding that it's possible to have another society where the working class have the whip hand and that collective workers' organisation can achieve, whether it's through the ballot box or revolution, but collective workers' organisation can achieve that new socialist society. That broad concept of the possibility of socialism still existed more for much of the 20th century than it does at this point in time. Now, having said that, there is a growing minority who are drawing socialist and revolutionary conclusions, and even if their conclusions are half-formed because they've never had the chance to really explore socialist ideas, it's our job to win those people and to help them to formulate their ideas and to win them to our socialist and Marxist programme. And the other side of things, the other side of the scissors, if you like, is the profound anger at the crisis of capitalism, the feeling that this system cannot deliver, and the beginnings of a searching for an alternative which is laying the basis for big leaps forward in consciousness and the adoption of a much broader mass socialist consciousness in the future. And that can be on the experience of struggle, also the question of a new stage of economic crisis, where the idea that austerity is temporary would have a real final death knell with a new stage of economic crisis and would be likely to lead to the development of widespread socialist consciousness, calls for nationalisation and so on. But it's also on the basis of subjective factors. We have to argue for socialism. We do. And we can win a significant minority of workers direct to our banner. But there's also the question of a mass scale, what would be possible. We do not give 1 inch to those that say Jeremy Corbyn had to moderate his programme because the working class isn't ready for socialists. They're not really, they don't understand it, so we had to have a very limited programme. It's nonsense. If Jeremy Corbyn had put a clear left radical programme, if he'd called for nationalisation of the privatised utilities and so on and so forth, of the banks, etc., it would have been enormously popular and it would have led to a big increase in support for socialist ideas in society. As it is, his programme is objectively very moderate. It can't really be called left reformist. Jeremy Corbyn in his youth, along with Tony Benn, would have called for the nationalisation of the top 25 monopolies as part of developing a socialist alternative to capitalism. Now he's not calling for nationalisation of anything except the railways, extremely gradually and partially. That's why we've used the term left populism, or elements of left populism, because of the limits of his programme at this point in time. But by the way, that can change in the future. Either Corbyn or new leaders can develop a much more hard-hitting left reformist programme. Because while we can win thousands and even tens of thousands direct to our revolutionary programme, the mass of the working class will first attempt to find a gradualer and they think more easy way to socialism, and therefore will demand, as they begin to draw socialist conclusions, a much more meaty, hard-hitting version of left reformism than the very limited programme that is being put forward by Corbyn at this point in time. Now, despite the limits of Corbyn's programme, the capitalist class do remain determined to get rid of him. And they are still threatened, they still fear the idea of a Jeremy Corbyn-led Labour government, particularly on the basis of a new economic crisis. His election would raise the hopes of millions, and he could be pushed further to the left. And they know that, and that's why they remain determined to do him in, and why we still have a civil war in the Labour Party. Now, I know some comrades are a little bit sceptical about calling it a civil war, because when the main tactic of one side seems to be to broker for peace and to retreat, then you think, well, is that really a civil war? But at the same time, it is still very clear that the right are set on undermining, strangling and ending Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party. They're despondent because they can't find a way to succeed. Actually, they're more fundamentally despondent than that. They're despondent because there is no social base for their pro-capitalist ideology. Tristram Hunt's remarks about why he retired to look after the V&A, where he said he's devoted a lot of time to thinking about how to renew social democracy for the 21st century, and has grown increasingly fearful that he doesn't have any answers to Labour's predicament. Well, he doesn't, and neither do any of the rest of them, in Britain or internationally, these pro-capitalist elements within the ex-social democratic or social democratic parties. But they might be depressed, but they're not giving up on trying to get rid of Jeremy Corbyn. And you've only got to look at the latest front in the Civil War, the battle taking place in Unite, in the hope of getting rid of McCluskey, in order to then be able to move against Jeremy Corbyn, to see that the Civil War is continuing. Now, I know, again, that lots of comrades will be thinking, it's true, it's really difficult to predict the exact outcome of events in Britain at the moment, but there's one thing I'm willing to take a bet on, and that is that Corbyn is going to continue to retreat, and Tom Watson's anaconda strategy to strangle him and get rid of him at a certain point is going to succeed. And we understand why comrades feel like that. Let's remember, though, back last summer, before the coup was launched, there was already the beginnings of a feeling of Corbyn's retreating, I'm not really sure he's getting anywhere, and a feeling that it was likely that he would be pushed out by the right wing. And then you had the coup attempt, and workers who'd previously been sceptical about Corbyn, recognising this was an attempt by the capitalist class to get hold of the Labour Party, and they were going to fight against it. And they flooded into the Labour Party in their hundreds of thousands. How long have I had that? 45, so I better rush in the last little bit. So it's not certain what will take place. We could see a continuation of a retreat, but on the other hand, there is the possibility of a new movement in support of Jeremy Corbyn. And we also have to say that even if what happens is a continued retreat and the right succeeding in getting rid of him at a certain point, that was in no way preordained. It did not have to happen like this. We know at the moment there is an ebbing of enthusiasm for Jeremy Corbyn amongst Stephen Hawkins, who was mentioned earlier, Owen Jones, but also amongst many of the good layer who were mobilised in his support initially and are now feeling he's not really cutting it. One element of that is Brexit. There's no question about it. That there was a section of people who do not understand why he is refusing to block Brexit taking place and argue against Article 50. But we have to explain here, the origin of his mistake was his first mistake. It was the concession that he would not put the socialist case for Brexit, the left case for Brexit, but instead gave in to the right very early on. When Diane Abbott goes on Newsnight and says, oh yes, I did turn up to Parliament this time, and I did vote for it, but you've got to understand, it's not a Tony Benn Brexit, this is a Donald Trump Brexit. You want to scream. I did scream at the TV. Whose fault is that? Because if they had put the case for a left and socialist Brexit, we would be in an entirely different situation now. Potentially millions of people who voted for Brexit in order to punish the government could have been won to a left programme. It could have resulted in the fall of the Tories and the election of a left Labour government. And certainly, the big layer of younger and more middle-class Jeremy Corbyn supporters who currently cannot understand the position he's taking on Brexit, in some cases would have been convinced, but at least would have understood why he was taking the position that he was. Now, I wanted to make one or two points on the question of immigration, but I'm going badly over time, so I'm going to compress them a lot. But there is a general point here. Because the referendum on both sides was led by pro-capitalist forces, because of what Jeremy Corbyn did, then it means that there was not the increase in the confidence and the cohesion of the working class which could have taken place as a result of defeating the government in the way that they did. And of course there has been a certain increase in racism and nationalism, and Trump going on about Brexit and being elected adds to that general atmosphere. And, you know, it's vital that the workers' movement fights against racism and for workers' unity. At the same time, we have to keep repeating that immigration was not the main thing which motivated people who voted for Brexit. Only 33% of them said that immigration was the central thing motivating them. And it is certainly not true, as the hysteria of the Gardenistas would have it, that the automatic victors as a result of the referendum are the right wing, the nationalists, UKIP and the rest of them. On the contrary, so far, UKIP threatened a mass demonstration and had to call it off. They lost the Stoke by-election. They're still lower in the opinion polls than they were before the referendum took place. Yes, UKIP or another right-wing populist force could step into the vacuum, but that will only be as a result of the failure of the workers' movement rather than them being anything automatic about it. And of course, it's enormously positive that there is a big section of young people and workers who are outraged at the growth of racism, outraged at the horror facing refugees, and are going out onto the streets to protest against racism, against Trump, and so on. And we have to play an important part in that struggle, mobilising for it and participating in it. But at the same time, one of our roles has to be to put forward a programme around which it's possible to unite the working class in order to defeat racism, in order to successfully defend the rights of refugees and so on. We do not accept for a minute that you cannot win workers to a socialist and internationalist position on immigration. You can, but not by supporting the boss's European single market, which means a race to the bottom. Not by, as the Blairites do, making pious statements against racism while implementing austerity. Only as part of a class struggle, uniting the working class, is it possible to win workers to an internationalist position. But that can be done. And it is important that we raise demands, fighting for the right for asylum, for closure of the detention centres, an end to the horror of children being locked up for years in detention centres for the crime of having to flee war. And also, as part of that programme, it's correct for us to raise versions of the demand that McCluskey has been groping towards in the General Secretary election, where he said that employers should have to have a proper trade union agreement before they can allow the recruitment of labour from abroad. And that idea is a question of raising class consciousness, that this is an issue of taking control from the bosses and gaining control for the working class. It's not a question of just a demand, it's something you fight for. As we know, in Lindsay, in the Farlead struggle recently, where workers from other countries have been put on the same wages as those that were already in Britain by a class struggle in order to achieve that position. But it's correct that we raise those demands. Now, of course, Corbyn's difficulties are not only related to Brexit, but his general failure to put a clear class programme. When he does, he's popular. When he said about the maximum wage, I think almost by accident, because he retreated on it quite quickly afterwards, but it got an echo immediately in the papers, because workers saw it as having a go at the rich and standing up for ordinary people. It's not the case that the only outcome to this process is gradual disillusionment of Corbyn supporters and the victory of the right. But it's certainly possible that that could take place. We have shown throughout this struggle that we will do everything possible to ensure Corbyn and the left's victory in their battle against the Blairites. That's why we applied, the 75 of us who've been expelled, to be allowed to join the Labour Party. It wasn't because we thought Tom Watson would say, oh, come in, we'd love to have you in the Labour Party. We knew they'd fume and fulminate. But the point was to put the onus on the left. If you want to transform this party, you have to be prepared to allow the Socialists in. As we know, not unexpectedly, that wasn't their response. And on the contrary, in their anxiety to compromise with the right, a vain but endless attempt to do so, then they've moved further. The witch hunt that's taken place in Momentum has largely left that organisation an empty shell. If you set yourselves up as the policemen and women of the left, whose job is to make sure that the Corbyn movement restricts itself to clinging on and waiting till 2020, which was the position that Landsman openly put to me and Peter when we discussed with him at the beginning of this process, you set yourself up like that, then you end where Momentum is today. Now, we should continue to intervene in Momentum locally where it's got anything worth having, but it doesn't have much. Even if you look at the figures from the survey that was done to justify the witch hunt, 20,000 members, 8,000 replying to the survey, 3,000 going to meetings. Those are small forces. Of course, organised around a clear programme, they could do something. But far from being organised around a clear programme, they are interested only in continuing to compromise with the right and to push out the left. And it means if there is a new surge in defence of Corbyn, it is not the most likely that it will go through the process of Momentum. Now, I think we've shown over the last year an extreme flexibility in tactics, but a firm and clear, principled position on programme. And the party recognises that. We've learned a lot through the experience of doing it. And the mood of confidence and optimism in this conference today is a reflection of the fantastic work that we have done over the course of the last year. We will continue to be flexible, but above all at this stage, to prioritise reaching fresh layers of workers and youth and recruiting them directly to the Socialist Party, and that will mainly take place on the picket lines and in the different community struggles in which we are involved. Whatever happens in the civil war in the Labour Party, and of course we want it still to have a positive outcome, and that's what we will strive for, but whatever happens, it represented the first spring, the first beginning of workers and young people looking for a left political alternative. But it is only an overture to what is coming in the future, where there will be a mass development of a socialist consciousness and the possibility of us building the support of thousands, tens of thousands, and of leading struggles, not to just defeat this or that government, but to break with capitalism and develop a new socialist future. And that's what we're discussing in this conference.